Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council for today's virtual event with Congressman Mike Waltz. I'm Halima Croft, Board Director at the Atlantic Council and Head of Global Commodity Strategy and MENA Research at RBC Capital Markets. Today, we are delighted to welcome the Honorable Mike Waltz, United States Congressman from Florida, to discuss the global challenges and opportunities facing a potential Republican president and Congress next year. Congressman Waltz will draw on some of the approaches to leadership that he has outlined in his new book, Hard Truths, Think and Lead Like a Green Beret. This event is part of the Atlantic Council's bipartisan election year series titled Election 2024, America's Role in the World, and is supported by RBC Capital Markets. RBC Capital Markets is delighted to support this convening and the larger Election 2024 series. Events like this one are essential for engaging Democratic citizens and shedding light on the implications of potential presidential administrations and congressional candidates. We were thrilled to host Senator Mark Warner and Senator Chris Murphy earlier in this series, and our audience should stay tuned for an event this Wednesday with Congressman Michael Turner. I look forward to a vibrant conversation here today. Through convenings like this, alongside our broader analysis, we fulfill our mission of providing the essential platform for analyzing the economic, political, and technological changes that will define the 21st century of shaping the global future together. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the United States built a rules-based international order and has upheld and strengthened that order through the Cold War into the present day, working alongside allies and partners to create a more secure and prosperous future for all. Today, the United States must traverse a military and economically aggressive China, an expansionist Russia in the third year of a brutal war, and turmoil in the Middle East. We are delighted to host Congressman Mike Waltz, who has experience in national security and foreign policy that few can match. I will now hand it over to our moderator. Thank you so much, Congressman Waltz, for joining us today.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Halima, for those welcoming remarks, and to RBC for the sponsorship of this event. My name is Matthew Kranig. I'm Vice President and Senior Director of the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And the conversation today is happening at a critical moment. U.S. presidential election is 1 week away, and everyone wants to know how will a next U.S. presidential administration deal with a challenging international environment? And so to discuss these issues today, we're very fortunate to have Congressman Mike Waltz. Congressman Waltz represents Florida, sits on the House Armed Services Committee and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Before being elected to Congress, he was an entrepreneur, a White House and Pentagon advisor, a Green Beret and colonel in the United States Army. In that role, he was deployed to Afghanistan, where he won multiple Bronze Star medals for heroism in combat. And one of the reasons he's here with us today is because he's also the author of a new book, Hard Truths, Think and Lead Like a Green Beret. So before we begin, let me share a few housekeeping notes. This event is public and on the record. Toward the end of our conversation, we will be opening it up for audience questions, so be thinking about your questions. And please submit your questions to askac.org, and please include your name and affiliation when you submit your question, and we'll ask those to the congressman. So without further ado, let's start the conversation. Congressman Waltz, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Thank you. Just thank you to the Atlantic Council for all the work you do, and good to be with you.
Well, it's good to have you here. And I thought we'd maybe start with the new book and then broaden out to talk about the future of U.S. foreign policy.
Sure.
So I read the book this weekend. I enjoyed it, and I'd recommend it to our viewers. And we'll drop a link in the chat for those who would like to purchase a copy. First question, why did you decide to write this book?
Well, I get asked on a regular basis when I'm talking to school groups, ROTC departments in universities, out amongst my constituents around the country. One, I get asked all the time, what's the difference in a Green Beret and a U.S. Navy SEAL and a Ranger? I answer that question, but I think that the answer is also illustrative of, perhaps how we can think differently about our foreign policy. And really the difference to boil it down, the SEALs and Rangers, some of the best of the world. For example, what we did to Osama bin Laden. Other side of the world, incredibly denied, difficult mission, in and out, lightning raid, literally 2 bullets on the forehead, and decapitated the leader of Al Qaeda. Finally, Green Berets take a much longer and systemic approach. We learn multiple languages. We specialize in parts of the world, and you can embed just a few of us, either with a local militia, a guerrilla resistance force, or even a partnered allied military, as I talk about in the book. Partnering with our NATO allies in Afghanistan and in Africa, and have, I believe, an outsized strategic impact that's a great return on investment for our military. And so I talk about those lessons learned, the different kind of mindset when you're very alone and often afraid, whether, again, it's with a warlord who would soon kill us as the bad guys, or in one of my tours where it was literally 3 Americans partnered with 90 Arabs in a joint task force, partnered with another 180 Afghans. The closest I'll ever get to Lawrence of Arabia, I think. But speaking of Lawrence of Arabia, I think was the original Green Beret. One man really tied down whole portions of the Ottoman Empire by, with, and through his Arab allies. And so applying that mindset, I think, to our broader foreign policy and national conversation, domestic issues as well, and how I try to now address the issues that we face in Washington and Capitol Hill. Sometimes I think the tribes of the DC swamp are tougher than the tribes I faced overseas, and corralling them in line with the direction I think the country needs to go. But that was the genesis of it. And thanks for letting me talk about it.
Yes, and well, you anticipated my next question, which was going to be to remind the viewers the difference between Green Berets and other special forces. And at the Scowcroft Center, we've done some work on the role of special operations forces in strategic competition. And in the book, I like, you give the example of how would they go about taking down a wall, where the SEALs would bust through it and the Green Berets would go to a construction worker nearby and say, hey, buddy, can you your bulldozer into this? So that was a good example. So you talk about 10 or so traits of leadership that you think are part of how Green Berets work, that translate to life, to business, to foreign policy. So it's restraint, discipline, bottom-up leadership, adaptability, resilience, determination, boldness, servant leadership, truth to power, persistence, vigilance. How did you settle on these 10 traits? Why these 10 traits and not others?
Well, it's not necessarily that I settled, on these traits and decided to write a book about them. It's just what I found through experience, what I found through going through the grueling training of Ranger School. Again, Special Forces training is a couple of years long versus several months. For example, with my friends and colleagues, the SEALs, learning the different languages, embedding in different types around the world. So it's what I found that actually worked in these incredibly isolated, difficult situations, and then kind of really bringing that out, how I've applied that to now my new role in Congress. So it kind of was a bottoms up mentality, and I tell the story in our final exercise in Green Beret training. I come across a guerrilla leader who puts me in a situation where either I have to agree to help him execute a prisoner, a government kind of secret police agent that they captured, or I walk away and completely sever the relationship, or I try to stop him, and pretty soon we're in a huge confrontation with his men with finger on their triggers and my guys with their fingers on my triggers. What do you do? How do you get out of that and still maintain that relationship? Do not have a strategic failure, but you can't be a party to a war crime, even though probably nobody would ever know. And so it's that moral compass and that adaptive mindset that I talk about, at least in that situation. And again, all of these things apply to life, to business, and certainly to politics.
Yeah, well, I think you started the book with that story, and it was really gripping and had my interest from the start. And I wonder if you might talk about, maybe choose one of these traits of leadership and talk about it in a little bit more depth. And if I could, maybe resilience would make sense. At the Atlantic Council, we've just set up a new Adrian Arsht National Security Resilience Initiative. We're trying to figure out what is resilience and why does it matter. And you tell some good stories in the book, one about Andre Mernay, but also some of your experiences with resilience. So would you maybe go in a little bit more depth on either resilience or one of the other traits that you think is
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about resilience, and then I think another one that we don't talk enough about in restraint, both in combat and in our broader foreign policy. And resilience, I just highlight these amazing Americans, whether it's Andre Mernane, who lost a foot and 9 months later was jumping out of perfectly good airplanes alongside me once again. Ken Dwyer, a captain I served with, lost an eye, an arm, and a leg. The system didn't know what to do with him because he kept refusing any type of disability payment, even though he absolutely deserved it, because he just wanted to get back to his force, back to the team, and back to the fight. He's still a serving active duty colonel, despite those incredible disabilities today, or even forgotten heroes like the first Puerto Rican Medal of Honor recipient, Rocky Versace, who the last anybody saw of him as a POW in Vietnam. He was being dragged by his hair into the torture chamber, screaming, "God bless America," at the top of his lung. So, where does that resilience come from? How do we inculcate it as a society? And one of the things that I talk about with a lot of my high school groups, I get asked kind of, what's the one bit of advice? Or for kids going off to the military academies that I've nominated, I tell them, you know what? You're going to fail. You're going to fail a lot. You're going to fail repeatedly over and over again. And it's how you deal with that, what you learn from it, and whether you have the guts and the grit to go at it again. And I talk about my own failures in Ranger School and Special Forces selection and campaigns. And I think you learn far more from your failures, but we don't talk about that a lot in a society that's kind of patting everybody on the head and giving everyone a trophy. And then just very quickly on restraint, look, we faced a situation in combat. We were told to hold the line, do not move, hold the flank. And pretty soon my sniper sees a young boy calling in mortar rounds on us as a sniper. I refused permission to fire. I told him fire a warning shot. We followed the kid into his village. Turned out the Taliban had lined up all the families of that village and told them to give their eldest son to the Taliban to attack us, or else. One family refused and they hung their little boy. And people need to hear those stories, understand the decisions we have to make. What was a cell phone a weapon in the laws of land warfare? Did I make the right call? And I kind of go through history, Grant and Lee, H.W. Bush not going all the way to Baghdad after Gulf War I, despite the pressure to do so. He stopped in Kuwait. I even talked about unsung heroes. A Soviet submarine captain who was ordered to fire a nuclear-tipped torpedo into the U.S. Navy's fleet that was blockading Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That captain refused. He went to the Gulag. You don't refuse order in Soviet Russia, but his restraint saved the world. And even in politics today, I think we need a lot more of that. I was accused of stolen valor in my first campaign, and my amazing wife and advisors, rather than hitting back and hitting hard, advised me to rise above it and stay focused on what I wanted to get done in Congress. So those are just a couple of traits that we talk about and how we can apply it today and how I have applied it.
I like the way how you tie the lessons you've learned in combat up to bigger foreign policy decisions. And I did note the H.W. Bush decision as the director of the Scowcroft Center. Of course, Scowcroft was his advisor for
right.
And as the manager of a think tank, I think there are lessons of leadership in here that I'll certainly take for myself: bottom-up leadership, servant leadership, and so on. So maybe as a kind of transition from the book to a discussion about the future of U.S. foreign policy, one of the other themes that comes through in the book is American exceptionalism. And you have some people who say, well, the United States has made a lot of mistakes. We've got a lot of problems at home. Why is that the wrong way to think about America's role in the world?
Well, I just think it's devoid of context and history that the United States obviously is not a perfect nation. We're always striving to be a more perfect union. But as Winston Churchill famously said, American democracy is perhaps the worst form of government in the world, except all the others, right? Or we always end up at the right answer after trying lots of wrong ones. I know I'm not getting that quote exactly right, but look, there are millions of people all over the world who are literally putting their lives on the line to come here legally, illegally, or what have you. And certainly we're a nation of immigrants, and I support legal immigration as strongly as I can. But if we're, a systemic, a nation that's systemically racist, misogynist, and colonialist, it's pretty incredible that people are trying to come here and so many other countries that they're trying to leave. And so I'll just leave that for what it's worth. But in terms of how many people we've lifted out of poverty across Asia, I tell the story in the book actually of an Arab officer talking to an Afghan tribe. And he's saying, look what the United States did for Germany. Look what the United States did for Europe. Look what they did for Japan. These were their sworn enemies. And yet the American people gave their time and their treasure to help their former enemies rebuild for a greater good, in line with our values that, has led to the rules-based world order that we have all enjoyed. And not perfect by any means, but that we've all enjoyed today. So I do think we are the shining hill on the shining light on the hill, excuse me. And we should be proud of that.
Yeah, well, it's a compelling point and a compelling book. So again, would recommend our viewers get the book. But maybe broadening out now to U.S. foreign policy. There's a presidential election next week, of course. It's too close to call, at least.
So I've heard, Matt. So I've heard. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, and so everyone, of course, wants to know what would U.S. foreign policy look like if Harris wins? What would it look like if Trump wins? And so maybe we'll start with Trump. What do you think a Trump foreign policy would look like come January 2025?
Yeah, look, in broad strokes, there's all kinds of interpretation of the term or slogan "America First" in there. I think Financial Times just had a good article today with a number of people that I expect to be involved. President Trump undeniably really drove the pivot in terms of dealing with China as a very serious competitor or even adversary in terms of, number one, getting control over our supply chains, getting control over the massive imbalance in trade that's going on, and rebuilding and shifting the focus of our military to deal with an adversary that the likes of which we've never faced in history. We've never faced one, certainly not Germany, Japan, or the Soviet Union, that had an economy that rivaled ours, that had control of so many of our basic elements of production, and now has a Navy that's larger than ours, a Space Force that's launching more than we are, and a nuclear arsenal that's tripling in size. We have not seen this kind of military buildup since Germany in the 1930s. And we need to begin focusing the nation on the threat that it is, because their form of deterrence lies not in necessarily in tanks, planes, and ships, but in ports, pipelines, grids, and water supply. And if we fail to deter them, they could find themselves controlling over 50% of GDP in terms of shipping lanes and access routes into Asia. So that will absolutely be a focus, but their domestic influence as well in our universities, in our media, in our entertainment system, and in our money and currency supply. So that will be one. Look, we can be allies and friends and have tough conversations. I have written speeches for 20 years, going back to Secretary Rumsfeld, practically begging our NATO allies to share their defense burden, The 2% of GDP is not a distant goal. I think Canada has it as a goal in 2032. That's completely unacceptable. And we can be friends and allies and have tough conversations. 2% is the minimum. We need to be celebrating those like Poland and like the Baltics who exceed that. And my question is, with the worst and most destructive war on their doorstep in Ukraine since World War II, if not now, then when? We should be at 100%. A long time ago when Russia invaded the first time in 2014. And then I think more broadly, you're going to see a focus on our Western Hemisphere. We have the energy, the critical minerals, the food supply to truly power the U.S. economy and in our Western Hemisphere. And I just think it gets woeful, a woeful lack of attention, frankly. And I'd say the last thing, Matt, is President Trump deeply appreciates, yes, our military has to be strong, but our true strength is in our economy and in our prosperity. That is the driver, I think, for the world order that we have, that has been relatively peaceful compared to the two world wars since the end of World War II. And there's a number of things, including our energy supply, that we need to do to sustain that.
So you mentioned Ukraine, and President Trump has said that the war would have never started if he had been president, and that he'll end the conflict within 24 hours. Some interpret that to mean he's just going to sell Ukraine down the river and give Putin a sweetheart deal. Is that what he intends, or what do you think a Ukraine policy would look like?
No, let's go for the first statement. Russia invaded a neighbor under President Bush, under President Obama, and under President Biden. They did not show this kind of aggression. They were deterred under President Trump. And let me just knock down just a couple of narratives that are out there. Let's look at what happened under the first Trump term. And despite a lot of hand-wringing in Washington, D.C., pulled out of the INF Treaty. Just because of just years and years of Russian cheating on it. And it constrained us in terms of how we're now dealing with long-range missile systems, in particular with China. So China is massively expanding its missile fleet. We're constraining ourselves, and the Russians are cheating. Pulled out of that treaty, pulled out of the Open Skies Treaty that Russia was also cheating on. Launched cruise missiles, actually enforced the red line when Assad in Syria were gassing and using chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction on its own people, a red line that was not enforced under the Obama administration. Did that while sitting across the table from Chairman Xi of China, and I think sent quite a message in what he was willing to do. ISIS largely defeated, Soleimani and Baghdadi dead. Soleimani also taken out of this earth, or off the table. Iran largely constrained. So, and by the way, in Syria, directly bombed 300 to 400 Russian mercenaries, the Wagner group, when again they dared attack us. So, I think President Trump, the facts show that he was far tougher on Russia than the narrative that kind of floats around Washington, D.C. and mainstream media. And in terms of Ukraine, look, it is a different strategic focus on ending the war versus this vague notion of what does winning look like, which despite 3 years of war now, I still, sitting in the skiff behind closed doors or out in public, I still cannot get a clear definition from the Biden administration. Are we willing as a nation? And if we are, he should make this case to expel every Russian soldier from every inch of Ukraine, including Crimea. How long? How much will that cost? What will that take? And what are our allies going to contribute? I think they should be exceeding U.S. commitments, not in parity with it. Those are all fair questions to ask. Finally, because I know this is a key focus of the Atlantic Council, and it should be, enforce the darn sanctions. Russia is selling just as much oil and gas, actually at discounted rates, through India and through China as it did pre-war. You lift the LNG ban that's currently in place, you flood global markets with clean American oil and gas, you drive down the price of oil. Now Putin's war machine is on its back foot. It literally won't be able to afford. And I've had analysts come to me with this from different agencies. You get that price below $50 a barrel, he's struggling. He's a gas station with nukes. Not only Russia, but Iran too, for that matter, and addressing our economic problems here at home. So those are just a number of things, I think, but energy, I should have started out with that, will be a key hallmark of getting them to the table.
Good. And looking at the clock, I see we have just over 15 minutes left to go. So I would ask our audience to be thinking of your questions, send them to us. And
I'll try to give shorter answers. Sorry.
No, you're very succinct, and it's great. So look for those questions coming in. I'll ask at least one more myself, and so hard to know where to go. Middle East, China, but you did mention energy, and I think there are areas where there's broad bipartisan consensus, maybe on China being the biggest state-based threat. Seems like climate change and energy is an area where there's still significant differences. How do you think a Trump administration would approach the climate energy set of issues in a second?
Well, all kinds of energy experts I talk to talk about natural gas, and particularly U.S. natural gas, which is far cleaner than what was flowing through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia, as a bridging fuel. You just cannot power modern economies on wind and solar, even as they exist today. But you start adding in the computing power and the energy needed for massive databases. I've talked to experts that say an AI search is 30 times more energy intensive than a normal Google search, right? So the demands of kind of the economies of the future, of quantum, of data, of AI, are only going to put more demands on our grid. And I've talked to our allies in South Korea and Japan, taking it back to the Ukraine discussion. They said, look, your diplomats are over here beating us up for buying Russian gas. We want to buy your gas from North America. You don't have a single terminal on the West Coast because the state governments of California, Washington, and Oregon won't allow it, won't permit it. So we literally have one being built through Vancouver and one being built through Mexico and not in the United States. They want to buy our natural gas, and we're literally constraining it and get them off of Russian gas. So again, I talked to the Speaker of the Parliament of Lithuania. She buys 85% of their energy needs from the United States. They're wringing their hands because of the LNG ban. They said, do you want us to go back to Russia? We can't. So it's enormously frustrating. I think we can take an all of the above approach. And then also nuclear, you're absolutely going to see a resurgent role in the United States. And then finally, look, when China is opening a new coal-fired plant that's scheduled to last 30 to 40 years in terms of the lifetime of those plants, they're opening a new one per week that's burning Russian coal. If you look at the largest manufacturer of solar panels in the world, it's in Western China, run by slave labor with the Uyghurs. And if you follow its transmission lines, there's 12 coal-fired power plants powering the solar panel manufacturing plant. So we just need to rationalize this entire piece. And I keep saying finally, but just one more. I'm also the co-chair of the U.S. India Caucus, and that is the strategic relationship of the 21st century, in my view, both from an economic and a military standpoint.
Good. Well, thanks. And you mentioned the U.S.-India Caucus. One of the other things that struck me in the book is you helped to set up the Women, Peace, and Security Caucus in Congress. Do you want to say a word about that?
Well, I tell the story in the book of an Afghan elder that I spent months and months building a relationship with, and I wanted his militia and his tribe on our side, not the bad guy's side. And he kept talking about this secret weapon, on and on about this secret weapon. And finally I called him the carpet. I said, I got to see this thing. This relationship can't continue. I didn't know, he said, fine, Commander Mike, and he sends one of his lieutenants in the back, and I hear a bunch of rustling. I didn't know if they're going to bring out a Stinger missile. They're going to bring out, these new version of Iranian landmines. What he brought out, Matt? He brought out his 2 daughters. And he was smuggling them over to India from a deeply, deeply Taliban-held area of Afghanistan to get them educated as a doctor and as a lawyer. And he was doing that for the other girls in his tribe as well. And he said, this is how you undermine the extremists. This is how you pull the rug out from underneath their hate. And, we all remember Malala Yousafzai, who was shot in the face, a little girl trying to go to school. And she said the thing the extremists fear the most is a girl with a book. So from my perspective, it's not just a feel-good issue, it's a key national security issue, because in societies where women are thriving across the board, extremism isn't. And we need to embrace that, in my view, as a national security community.
Compelling point. And we do have some questions rolling in now from the audience. And so maybe not a surprise question about, we talked about the conflict in Ukraine, but now a question about the conflict in the Middle East. The Biden administration has said that Israel has a right to defend itself, but that also we need to get to a ceasefire. Trump has said, I believe, that Israel should, quote, finish what it started and get it over with fast. How are we doing in the Middle East? How would Trump administration approach the conflict in the Middle East?
Well, let's just contrast 4 years ago, and I don't mean this to sound as partisan as it probably does, but it's just a fact that 4 years ago we were signing peace deals on the White House lawn with the Abraham Accords, poised to expand even further. And look at where we are today. And I believe this is a crumbling of deterrence. I think the trying to re-enter the Iran deal once again, and the appeasement that went along with that, including negotiating through the Chinese and Russians as intermediaries of all things, has really emboldened Iran, has enriched Iran, and I think the failings of the Biden approach has been its focus on Israel and on Gaza and pressuring Israel to restrain, rather than focusing on the core issue, which is Iran. And as long as Iran is flush with cash, it will continue to pour weapons, training, and money into Hezbollah, into Hamas, and into the Houthis that have choked off global shipping through the Red Sea. So until we deal with that, and in the House, we passed secondary sanctions on Chinese buyers of Iranian oil and gas a year ago. The Senate hasn't taken them up, which I find incredibly frustrating. Just 4 years ago, the Iranians, their oil exports dropped from 4 million a day to under 400,000. Their currency was tanking. They were truly on their back foot. And we heard those proxies complaining that they weren't getting any money anymore. They couldn't pay their fighters. They couldn't buy weapons. We need to get back to that posture. And then secondarily, from a moral standpoint, we need to get behind the Iranian people. Mahsa Amini, the young girl who was literally bludgeoned to death for daring to not wear a hijab, should be a household name in the United States, much as we made Soviet dissidents household names. And her death sparked a massive uprising of people crying out for freedom across all the factions of the Iranian people. And I think our silence in the face of that was deeply, deeply disappointing and a strategic mistake. So those two things, in my view, would put the Ayatollahs on the back foot. But they're so emboldened right now, they think they can cross a red line of killing. Talk about election interference, of assassinating a former president and leading a presidential campaign. And regardless of what you think of them, that's not a partisan issue. We need to be sending a message loud and clear that is a red line that will never be tolerated to all of our adversaries, and that will come with massive repercussions. We have to restore deterrence.
Well, speaking of restoring deterrence, you need the defense force posture to do that. So we have a couple of questions that have come in on defense posture. So maybe lump them together. At the Scowcroft Center, we're fortunate to have a military fellows program, one fellow for the year from each service. So this year, Mike Hogan is our Navy fellow, and he asks, quote, "Our Navy has been underfunded by several administrations despite a repeated call for 350 plus ships. Is Congress willing to actually provide the money necessary to build the fleet that they say we need to deter or fight China?" And then second, Mark Massa, a nuclear deterrence specialist at the Scowcroft Center, who points out that New START will be expiring. The Pentagon has said that nuclear deterrence is the top priority of the Department of Defense. There was a recent congressional commission on which I was honored to serve that essentially recommended in a bipartisan way that the United States needs to think about its first strategic forces buildup since the end of the Cold War. So if we could maybe take those together, how do you think about the future of U.S. defense posture, including Navy, including nuclear deterrence?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and there's a common thread through both of those answers. The answer for the Navy is broader than more money, less money to the Navy. And I am working a piece of legislation, bipartisan, bicameral, called the SHIP Act with Senator Mark Kelly over in the Senate, the first senator, ironically from Arizona, but to go through the Merchant Marine Academy. And the Chinese naval buildup is on the backs of its massive commercial naval or maritime enterprise, I should say. So we've gone from the 80s, from 300 shipyards down to 20. If President Trump came in, or Kamala Harris, or anybody came in and said, I want to build a 500 ship Navy, we literally no longer have the steel, the aluminum, the yards, the workers, the IP to do it. And that's, in my view, what we have to revitalize over a longer term. You know, there's so many industries, from pharmaceuticals to basic manufacturing, that we offshored in this kind of, obsession with cheap everything. And we didn't just offshore it, it went into the hands of our greatest adversary in the Chinese Communist Party. So just another statistic by point of comparison, last year, China received 1,500 new orders for new ships of all kinds. We received 5. So the disparity is like magnitudes out of whack. And so whether it's opportunity zones for shipyards and how to attract foreign investments in our workforce, investments in trades, the welders, the electricians, the what have you, that we have to make, that's what I'm focused on, because you could fit every shipyard in the United States inside of China's largest right now. And that's what we have to get back at. Same with our nuclear enterprise. We couldn't make the pits, as you know, Matt, right? If we need to, I think we need an investment in our broader civil nuclear whole entire ecosystem. And I'm all about incentives and incentivizing private capital to do that, getting government out of the way so those investments make sense, from regulations, burdens, permitting reform that keep investors on the sideline. And that'll really be the focus of both. But right now, in the very near term, I think back to your Naval Fellows piece or question, the shipbuilding expertise and the ability to do it at scale outside of China sits in Japan and North Korea. Japan and South Korea. I want to be very clear on that. And getting them engaged in a meaningful way is something we just have no choice. We'll have to do in the short term. And right now, you're looking at Daewoo's buy into the Philly shipyard as a case in point.
Okay, good. Well, we have time, I think, I know you have a flight to catch, and we're scheduled to end in about 5 minutes. I think we have time for one more question from the audience. And here's maybe a good one to end on. It says, we've talked a lot about what a Trump foreign policy might look like. What's your perspective of what a Harris foreign policy might look like? Any strengths? What are the weaknesses? And I know that's a lot to cover in just a couple minutes, but anything you'd like to highlight?
Well, I just think it's more, it'll be more of the same of what we're currently seeing. And one, I just don't know that we can afford it. Back to the burden sharing issue, when the interest alone on our national debt for the first time in American history exceeds our entire defense budget. The answer, the questions and issues coming out of the Pentagon can no longer be, can you just give us more money? Because it's not there. And then in terms of our approach to our adversaries, we have to pivot on our Iran policy. One can only imagine if one of those missiles coming in that we just saw them fire hundreds of at Israel. The Israelis even had a suspicion that one had a nuclear warhead on it. You can't wait for the mushroom cloud until you respond, right? So we are really getting to the precipice here. And the thing the regime cares about the most is money and its control. And, you know, again, those are the two pieces that I spoke to earlier. And look, we're seeing the Ukrainian conflict with now North Korea not just providing mountains of artillery rounds, but thousands of soldiers. And now the South Koreans pondering how they're going to reply and respond. We cannot have a global proxy war spinning out of control in Ukraine, as much as we admire and believe in the Ukrainians' fight for their freedom. So I just don't think more of the same can be the answer, but I have not seen any policy articulation out of the Harris campaign, none, that indicates a different path.
Okay, well, thanks very much. And just a minute or two to go. So maybe final question from me. I see Politico reports that you're rumored to maybe be a top cabinet official in a Trump administration. Do you care to make any news here today? If
no, I'm going to be in Western Pennsylvania, you know, and it's 7 swing states, and having, I think, a clear declared victor, which of course I hope is my guy and my team, for all the reasons I just laid out going forward. And just one more piece, because it's comes up in every single campaign stop, is the border. You know, I was just talking to a homeless veteran who, you know, was in a shelter reading the paper about 174 hotels in New York that are full of migrants on taxpayer dollars. So look, the thing that's so frustrating to me, and this is kind of bringing it full circle to the book, is it's the cartels behind so much of this. They are literally making billions. These are the Mexican cartels on human trafficking. 40% of the girls coming across our border are sold into trafficking and sex slavery. It's horrendous. There's rape tents in the Darien Gap that these women have to pass through to continue their journey. It's absolutely sickening. We know as Green Berets how to take down a network. We worked with Plan Colombia in the 90s, took down the Medellin cartel, and stopped Colombia from being taken over by narco terrorists in the FARC with just a few dozen Green Berets. I'm not talking, when we talk about using military resources to take on the Mexican cartels, which, by the way, are fighting the Mexican army to a standstill, shooting down helicopters, controlling 30% of our neighbor's territory. I'm not talking about invading Mexico with the Marines like the media wants to spin it, but we do have offensive cyber. We can start intercepting their money. We can start jamming their ability to communicate. We can put their leadership on their back foot. And we're talking space, cyber, and other resources to give law enforcement the tools that they don't currently have. And I think just take a very different posture than the passive one we have right now.
Well, thanks for bringing up immigration. I should have asked about that. If you look at the opinion polling, it is one of the issues top of mind for voters as they head to the polls on Tuesday. And I think we're out of time. We don't want you to miss your flight, but thank you very much, Congressman Waltz, for your service. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks for the oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, if I could just have one thing. You were going to mention the book Hard Truths, and I just wanted to be sure to put out there that my proceeds are going to Gold Star Families charity, the Matthew Pacino Foundation, one of the Green Berets that I lost. So it's all going to a good cause, and hope people get some insights from my time all over the world and now in DC.
Well, that's very generous of you to donate the proceeds, and remind our viewers that there is a link in the chat if you'd like to buy the book. And thank you again very much, Congressman Waltz. And would remind our viewers that we'll be doing this, a version of this again on Wednesday. We'll have Congressman Mike Turner of Ohio giving his perspective on what to expect from the United States foreign policy after the elections. So thank you very much. We'll see you then.